Obinna Adewale was a man whose name echoed through every corner of Lagos, Abuja, and beyond. At just 40, he was already counted among the most powerful billionaires in Nigeria. A man who had built his empire on steel, oil, and high-rise towers that touched the sky. His life was the kind most people could only dream of: chauffeured cars, private jets, sprawling mansions, and a presence at every high-profile gala. The media loved him, and so did the people who benefited from his wealth. Yet behind the shiny facade lay a man constantly surrounded by enemies who envied his success. He lived every day with bodyguards, fences, and tinted windows, yet deep down, he knew that no amount of money could buy complete safety. His enemies had failed to break him in boardrooms, and they had failed to defeat him in courtrooms, but they were still waiting, biding their time, sharpening their knives for the day he would slip. That day, unknown to Obinna, was coming much sooner than he could imagine. The evening was painted with golden light as Obinna left his office skyscraper in Victoria Island, a building that bore his name in bold silver letters across the glass. He had just finalized another deal that would push his empire into international waters, and for a moment, pride swelled in his chest. His convoy of cars lined up, engines humming, bodyguards in black suits waiting for the signal. But in a rare twist of stubbornness, Obinna waved them off. "Not tonight," he told his chief of security. "I want to drive alone. I need to breathe." It wasn't the first time he had demanded solitude, but it was certainly the riskiest. He slid into his sleek black Mercedes-Benz, leather seats wrapping around him like an embrace. For a man of such wealth, danger often lived in the shadows, and tonight those shadows were thicker than ever. He drove past the neon lights of Lagos nightlife, his mind drifting between triumph and the lingering question that haunted him. Who among his so-called friends was plotting against him? Somewhere across town, in a quiet and forgotten street, a young woman named Amara was closing her small shift at a local restaurant. She was no stranger to hardship, her life carved by poverty and long days of carrying trays, scrubbing dishes, and serving those who barely noticed her existence. Yet, there was a fire in her spirit, a kindness that never dimmed even when her hands cracked from soap water or when her belly ached from skipping meals. Amara's world was small, but her heart was vast, and though she had never crossed paths with Obinna Adewale, destiny had already written her into his story. She had no idea that within the hour, she would stand face to face with the man whose name filled newspapers, and that her choices would ripple into something far greater than she could have imagined. As Obinna drove down the coastal highway, the night air brushed against his face through the slightly lowered window. The sea glittered under the moonlight, waves rolling like an ancient drumbeat against the shore. For a fleeting moment, he felt free. Free from contracts, free from boardrooms, free from the weight of being Nigeria's billionaire son. But freedom is often the most dangerous illusion, and in that illusion lay the trap set by his enemies. Just ahead, a truck waited, parked in the shadows with its headlights off. The driver, paid handsomely by those who wanted Obinna gone, gripped the wheel with trembling hands. This was no random accident waiting to happen. It was a meticulously planned strike, the culmination of envy and hatred that had fermented for years. The Mercedes glided smoothly until, in a blink, chaos erupted. The truck roared to life, lunging forward with terrifying speed. Obinna saw the blinding flash of headlights too late. Tires screeched, metal clashed, and the world spun into a nightmare of broken glass, twisting steel, and shattering bones. His car flipped twice, crashing against the railing, sparks bursting like fireworks into the dark. Inside, Obinna's head slammed against the steering wheel, his body pinned, his vision fading into a blur of blood and smoke. The billionaire who once ruled his empire with an iron hand was reduced to nothing more than a fragile, broken man clinging to the edge of life. The highway grew silent, save for the faint crackle of fire licking the car's frame and the distant howl of the sea. Fate, however, was not finished with Obinna Adewale. From the roadside, Amara had witnessed the horrific scene unfold. She had been walking home, her sandals slapping the ground, when the screech of tires made her freeze. In an instant, she saw the black Mercedes somersault, its metal body contorting like paper. Without thinking twice, her legs carried her forward, heart pounding against her ribs. Smoke filled her lungs as she reached the wreck, her eyes watering, but she refused to turn away. She saw him then, bloodied, unconscious, trapped behind the shattered windshield. She had no time to weigh the risks, no thought of who he was or how dangerous it might be. To her, he wasn't a billionaire, he wasn't a stranger. He was just a man dying in front of her, and she knew she had to save him. Clenching her fists, Amara yanked at the bent door, her palms burning, her arms trembling, her breath tearing through her chest. Slowly, painfully, the door gave way, and with all the strength her frail body could muster, she pulled him out onto the cold asphalt. She whispered desperately, "Stay with me, please, stay with me," though she wasn't sure if he could even hear. The sound of sirens was still far away, swallowed by the endless night, but Amara refused to wait. Her arms slid under his shoulders as she dragged him inch by inch away from the leaking car, terrified it might explode. The weight of his body nearly crushed her, sweat mixing with blood as her muscles screamed for mercy. Yet, she did not stop. She laid him gently on the side of the road, her hands shaking as she tore a piece of cloth from her own dress to press against his wounds. The face she had only seen once on television now lay before her, vulnerable, pale, and broken. In that moment, their worlds collided, not as servant and master, not as poor and rich, but as two human beings bound by survival. And though neither of them knew it yet, this night was not just about saving a life. It was the beginning of a bond that would change everything. The days that followed the accident moved slowly, each moment weighted with a strange mixture of relief and unease. Michael Carter, the billionaire whose empire stretched across continents, now found himself confined to the sterile walls of a private hospital suite. The constant beeping of machines, the faint smell of disinfectant, and the hushed footsteps of nurses became his new reality. Gone were the grand boardrooms and glittering parties. Now, his world was reduced to bandages for drips and whispered consultations with doctors. Amara visited daily, her presence an anchor amid the storm. She had no obligation to him. She was neither family nor friend when this began, but her steady hands and unwavering compassion had saved his life that night. Every time Michael opened his eyes and saw her there, a quiet gratitude stirred within him, something he had rarely felt in his life of privilege. And yet, beneath the calm surface, a dark question gnawed at his mind. Who had orchestrated the crash? Because he knew with certainty it hadn't been an accident. It was during one of those evenings, when the golden light of dusk poured through the tall hospital windows, that Amara finally voiced the question she had been holding back. Sitting beside his bed, her voice gentle but firm, she asked, "Michael, who did this to you?" For a long moment, he stared at the ceiling, the lines of his face tense, as though weighing the cost of speaking aloud a truth too dangerous to share. Finally, his lips parted, and with a voice low and unsteady, he whispered a name. The words struck the air like a dagger, heavy with betrayal. It wasn't some nameless rival or faceless enemy. It was someone he had once called a friend, a business partner who had dined at his table, laughed in his home, and pledged loyalty in public. That knowledge shook Amara. She could see the pain in his eyes was not just from broken bones, but from the deeper wound of betrayal. "You have to tell the police," she urged, her eyes sharp with determination. Michael hesitated, his pride resisting, but in the end he nodded. For perhaps the first time in his powerful life, he realized he needed someone else to carry his voice when his own strength faltered. Amara did not waste a moment. The very next morning, she walked into the nearest police station, her heart pounding but her steps steady. She was not a woman accustomed to dealing with officers or navigating the labyrinth of power, yet she carried herself with courage. Sitting across the desk from the inspector, she recounted everything Michael had told her. The suspicious circumstances of the crash, the rival's threats, the names spoken in a broken whisper under the glow of hospital lights. The inspector listened closely, scribbling notes, his eyes narrowing with interest. "If this is true," he said, "then this was no accident. It was attempted murder." Those words lingered in the air like a chill. Amara nodded, knowing the weight of what she had just set in motion. For Michael, she had become more than the woman who pulled him from wreckage. She had become his voice, his shield, and now his fighter in a battle far greater than she had imagined. Meanwhile, Michael's empire trembled on the edge of uncertainty. The news of his accident had already reached the media, and rumors spread like wildfire. Investors whispered, board members exchanged tense glances, and opportunists circled like vultures. His absence created a vacuum, and his enemies sought to exploit it. But amidst all the chaos, Michael found himself thinking less about business and more about the young woman who refused to leave his side. Each time she entered the room, carrying her calm strength, he felt a strange warmth stir in him. A warmth he had buried long ago under layers of wealth, pride, and ambition. He watched her speak to the nurses, arrange his flowers, and even challenge the doctors when they seemed dismissive. It struck him again and again that she owed him nothing, yet she gave him everything she could. In his weakest hour, it was Amara who became his strength. For the first time in his life, he wondered if wealth and power were truly the foundations of security, or if it was something simpler, purer, and far rarer. The police moved quickly. Within days, evidence began to surface. Altered brake lines on Michael's car, phone records tying the rival to suspicious calls, and a trail of financial transactions pointing to hired men. When the arrest finally came, it made headlines across the nation. A powerful businessman, once Michael's closest ally, was led away in handcuffs under the glare of flashing cameras. The betrayal was laid bare for the world to see, and the justice system prepared to deal its blow. Yet for Michael, the moment was not one of triumph but of quiet sorrow. Sitting in his hospital bed, watching the news coverage, he felt a hollowness he could not describe. Power had always been his shield, but now he saw how fragile it truly was. As the cameras flashed on his rival's disgraced face, Michael turned to Amara, who sat quietly by his side, her hand resting gently on the arm of his chair. "You saved me twice," he said softly, "once from the wreckage, and once from the silence." She looked at him, her eyes shining with humility, and replied, "Sometimes all a man needs is someone willing to stand beside him." In the weeks that followed, Michael's recovery became not just a physical journey, but an emotional one. His body healed slowly under the care of doctors, but it was his spirit that found the greatest transformation. He no longer spoke with the arrogance of a man untouchable by the world. Instead, he listened more, asked questions, and showed gratitude in ways that surprised everyone around him. And at the heart of this change was Amara. She wasn't wealthy. She wasn't connected. She wasn't someone the world would ever expect to stand beside a billionaire. But Michael saw in her something far more valuable than money. Courage, honesty, and a loyalty that could not be bought. Late at night, when the hospital was quiet and the city lights twinkled outside his window, Michael would find himself studying her, wondering how a woman with so little could give so much. And in that wondering, a new feeling began to bloom. One he hadn't felt in years, perhaps ever. It wasn't gratitude anymore. It wasn't obligation. It was love, quiet but undeniable, growing in the cracks of his once unshakable heart. Days stretched into weeks, and with every sunrise, Michael Carter found himself relying less on the machines and more on the simple strength of his own body. The doctors praised his resilience, though they often remarked that it wasn't just medicine or surgery that carried him forward. It was the determination in his eyes. That determination, Michael knew, had not been born from himself alone. It came from Amara, the woman who stood by him when the world faltered. Each time she walked into the room, dressed simply yet radiating an inner light that no riches could replicate, he felt as if she brought the sun with her. Sometimes she arrived carrying books to read aloud, sometimes with home-cooked meals that reminded him of warmth long absent from his life, and sometimes with nothing but silence, a silence that spoke louder than words because it said, "I am here, and I will not leave." Michael had entertained presidents and dined with kings, yet never had he felt as profoundly moved as he did by this ordinary woman's extraordinary loyalty. And in that realization, something inside him shifted. He began to ask himself questions he had once dismissed. Questions about what truly mattered, about the meaning of wealth, and about the hollow victories that came from climbing ladders built on greed and betrayal. Amara, for her part, had never imagined her life would intertwine so closely with that of a billionaire. She was just a woman trying to live honestly, working to support herself and her family, carrying her own burdens with quiet strength. Yet fate had thrust her into Michael's story, and she found herself in a world she had only glimpsed from the outside. The marble hallways of the hospital were filled with men in tailored suits, lawyers whispering about contracts, and aides carrying tablets buzzing with updates. But when they looked at her, some saw only an outsider, a stranger who did not belong. Amara ignored their stares. She had never been one to measure herself by the judgment of others. What mattered was the man lying in the bed, the man whose life she had saved, whose trust she now carried like a sacred promise. She noticed, too, the subtle change in him. He was softer in his tone, more patient with the nurses, more willing to listen. And though she would never say it aloud, she felt a strange pride in knowing she had been the one to awaken that gentleness. Still, she reminded herself to be cautious. Billionaires lived in worlds of fleeting loyalty and power plays. She would not allow herself to be dazzled by wealth or status. Yet deep within, she could not deny that something was growing between them. Something fragile, yet impossibly real. The day came when Michael was finally discharged from the hospital. The media swarmed outside, cameras flashing, microphones thrust forward, hungry for a glimpse of the man who had survived what the world now knew was an assassination attempt. His security team surrounded him, but Michael raised his hand and said softly, "She rides with me." He was speaking of Amara. The guards exchanged wary glances, unused to seeing their boss extend such trust to anyone outside his inner circle. But they obeyed. Amara climbed into the sleek black car, feeling the weight of eyes and lenses capturing every second. She wasn't sure what the world would think, nor did she care. Michael sat beside her, his body still fragile, his movements careful, but his presence powerful as ever. The city skyline loomed outside the tinted windows, but Michael was focused only on her. "You've given me more than my life back," he said quietly. "You've given me clarity." Amara looked at him, unsure how to respond, her heart quickening at the sincerity in his voice. The car sped through the city streets, but for both of them, it felt like the world had slowed, as if time itself was giving them space to acknowledge the unspoken bond that had grown between them. Life at the Carter estate was unlike anything Amara had ever seen. The mansion rose like a palace on the outskirts of the city, marble pillars, endless gardens, fountains dancing in the sunlight. Inside, chandeliers sparkled, and hallways stretched like something from a dream. To Michael, it had always been home, yet now, walking through its grand corridors, he saw it differently. It was vast but empty, luxurious but cold. For all its beauty, it lacked the warmth that only human connection could bring. As Amara stepped hesitantly into this new world, she carried herself with dignity, not awe. She helped him settle into his study, brought him water when he coughed, and opened the curtains to let the morning light flood in. Michael's staff watched with quiet curiosity. They had served countless guests and acquaintances, but this woman was different. She didn't seek favors, didn't flaunt her proximity to him. She simply cared. And slowly, even the skeptical staff began to respect her. One evening, as Michael sat in his study, Amara walked in holding a tray of tea. He smiled faintly and said, "This house has never felt alive until now." She froze, her cheeks warming, unsure how to respond, but the truth of his words lingered between them like a spark catching flame. Yet not all was peace. The world outside the mansion was still watching, still whispering. The trial of Michael's former partner dominated the news, with journalists dissecting every detail of the betrayal. Some speculated about Michael's recovery, others about his company's stability, and some, inevitably, began to notice the quiet figure always by his side. A woman who did not belong to the circles of the elite. Whispers grew into questions, questions into gossip. "Who is she?" they asked. "Why is she always with him?" For Michael, the answer was simple, though he had yet to say it aloud. She was his savior, his anchor, his reason to keep breathing. One night, as the two sat on the balcony overlooking the gardens, the city lights twinkling in the distance, Michael turned to her with a seriousness that caught her off guard. "Amara," he said softly, "the world may not understand this, but I don't care anymore. When I look at you, I see more than the woman who saved my life. I see the woman who has changed it." Amara's breath caught, her eyes widening as emotions swirled within her. She wanted to respond, to put her feelings into words, but all she could do was meet his gaze, her silence heavy with meaning. In that moment, neither wealth nor status mattered. Only truth did. As the weeks passed, their bond deepened, and Michael found himself experiencing something he had long believed impossible. Genuine happiness. It wasn't the thrill of a business deal or the applause of a crowd. It was the quiet joy of simple moments shared with Amara. A walk through the gardens at dawn, laughter over clumsily cooked meals in the kitchen, long conversations that stretched late into the night. These were the treasures he had never known he was missing. And for Amara, though she still carried the weight of caution in her heart, she could not deny the tenderness that had taken root. Michael was no longer just the billionaire she had rescued. He was a man with scars, regrets, and a longing for something real. Together, they had crossed the line from strangers to companions, from savior and survivor to something far more profound. Yet neither had spoken the final word, the one that would define what they had become. It hovered between them, unspoken but undeniable, waiting for the moment when fear would give way to courage, and courage would give way to love. But as with every story where light begins to bloom, shadows always linger nearby. Michael and Amara's quiet bond did not escape the notice of those who had long profited from his isolation. Within his company boardrooms, whispers spread like wildfire. Some of his closest advisors, men who had once bowed to him without question, now murmured about how distracted he had become, how he allowed an outsider to influence his decisions. At first, Michael dismissed it as petty jealousy, but it soon became clear that not everyone would accept Amara's presence with silence. Invitations to high-profile events arrived, and when Michael insisted that Amara attend by his side, the reaction was swift and merciless. Cameras captured her every move, tabloids printed headlines dripping with scorn, and social media mocked the idea of a billionaire falling for a nobody. Amara endured the storm with quiet grace, but Michael felt rage boiling within him. For years, he had been called ruthless in business, feared for his ability to crush opponents, yet now the battle he fought was not for profit, but for the dignity of the woman who had saved his life. And though he had conquered empires, he realized this was the fight that truly mattered. Amara, however, was not blind to the cost. Sitting by the grand windows of the mansion one evening, she stared out at the sprawling gardens, her thoughts heavy. The world she had entered was a gilded cage, glittering on the outside, suffocating on the inside. She thought of her modest apartment, of evenings spent cooking simple meals, of laughter with her younger siblings, and wondered if she had made a mistake. Was she burdening Michael? Was she dragging him into battles he did not need to fight? The man had already survived betrayal and assassination. He deserved peace, not more conflict. When Michael entered the room and saw her distant expression, he asked gently, "What are you thinking?" She turned to him, her eyes filled with conflict. "I'm thinking that maybe I don't belong here," she whispered. For a moment, Michael was silent, as though struck by the very thought of her leaving. Then he crossed the room, his steps slow but determined, and took her hands in his. "Amara," he said with a quiet intensity, "I've spent my life surrounded by people who wanted something from me, money, power, status. You're the first who has given without asking. Don't ever tell yourself you don't belong. You're the only thing that makes this world bearable." Her eyes softened, her resolve wavering, and in that moment, a truth neither had yet spoken became undeniable. They needed each other more than either had imagined. But fate, relentless as ever, had one final test to place before them. News broke that the man responsible for orchestrating Michael's accident, his former partner turned rival, was using his trial as a stage to twist the narrative. He painted himself as the victim, accusing Michael of corruption, claiming that the accident had been staged for sympathy. Though the evidence against him was overwhelming, the noise of lies threatened to muddy the waters. Michael, still regaining his strength, found himself dragged into a public war he had no desire to fight. Amara watched helplessly as the media tore at him, portraying him as a puppet master of deception. It was during one of these dark days that Amara made a choice. She visited the prosecutor's office, recounting in vivid detail the night of the accident. The way she had found Michael broken on the roadside, the blood, the desperation, the truth of his suffering. Her testimony carried a raw humanity that no lawyer's polished speech could replicate. When the trial reconvened, her words silenced the courtroom. For the first time, the truth was not just evidence on paper. It was a living story told by the woman who had seen it all. And in that silence, the rival's facade began to crack. In the weeks that followed, the tide shifted. The rival was convicted, sentenced, and stripped of his empire. Justice had finally been served, yet the ordeal left Michael weary. Late one evening, as the two sat on the balcony overlooking the city lights, Michael turned to Amara with a rare vulnerability in his eyes. "I used to think victory meant defeating enemies, making the world bend to my will," he admitted. "But when I was lying there broken, what victory did I have? None of it mattered. Not the money, not the towers, not the power. What mattered was the hand that reached for me when everyone else turned away. That was you." His words hung in the air, heavy with emotion, and Amara felt tears prick her eyes. She had saved his life that night, yes, but he had given her something too. A love that saw her not as a servant of fate, but as an equal, as someone who mattered. She whispered back, "Maybe we both saved each other." And for the first time, Michael allowed himself to believe that his life was not defined by the empire he had built, but by the woman who now sat beside him. Their story, however, did not end with courtroom victories or whispered confessions. It unfolded in the quiet days that followed, in the ordinary moments that became extraordinary because they shared them together. Michael learned the rhythm of a simpler life. Early morning walks in the garden, cooking breakfast side by side, learning to laugh without a reason. Amara, too, found herself transformed. She was no longer the outsider who stumbled into a billionaire's life by chance. She was his partner, his anchor, his hope. The mansion no longer felt cold, nor did the world outside feel overwhelming, because together they had created a sanctuary. When Michael finally asked her, under a sky painted with stars, "Will you stay with me, not as my savior, but as my wife?" Amara's answer came not in words, but in the tears that fell down her cheeks as she nodded. And in that moment, surrounded by silence and starlight, the billionaire who once thought he had everything realized he had been empty all along. Until Amara filled his life with meaning. The night after Amara nodded through her tears, Michael could not sleep. He lay awake in the quiet expanse of the mansion, listening to the faint sound of the city outside, his thoughts circling the woman who had said yes to sharing her life with him. For a man who had lived through boardroom wars and deadly betrayals, it seemed almost absurd that his heart now raced like a boy's, fragile and unguarded. He rose from the bed, wrapped in a robe, and walked out onto the balcony where the cool night air pressed against his skin. The stars above glimmered, but none of them shone brighter than the memory of Amara's trembling nod, the way her tears had caught the moonlight. He closed his eyes and whispered a vow not to wealth, not to legacy, but to her. "I will protect you, I will honor you, and I will never let this world hurt you again." Down the hallway, Amara stirred in her sleep, as though some piece of her soul had heard his unspoken promise. For the first time in years, Michael did not feel like a ruler or a billionaire or a man fighting enemies. He simply felt like a human being in love, and it was enough. The days that followed were filled with preparations, though not the kind the world expected of a man like Michael. Advisors tried to convince him to announce his engagement with spectacle. Lavish parties, magazine covers, global headlines, but Michael dismissed them all. This was not a transaction, not a performance, and he refused to let it become one. Instead, he and Amara planned quietly, speaking late into the night about what they wanted their union to mean. She confessed her fears of being swallowed by his world, of being turned into a trophy wife, of losing the very simplicity that defined her. He listened, every word carving itself into his heart, and promised her that their marriage would not be a cage but a sanctuary. When he placed the ring on her finger in the privacy of the garden where she had once first walked with him during his recovery, it was not a gesture of power but of surrender. She looked at the diamond, dazzling in the sunlight, and whispered, "This is too much." He cupped her cheek, smiled faintly, and replied, "No, you are too much for this world, for me, for everything I thought I deserved, and that is why I will spend the rest of my life trying to be worthy of you." It was then Amara realized that wealth had not corrupted him, it had caged him, and she was the one who had set him free. Their wedding was nothing like the tabloids had predicted. Instead of a grand cathedral filled with royalty and tycoons, they married in a sunlit courtyard of Michael's estate, surrounded only by the handful of people who truly mattered. Amara wore a simple but elegant gown that shimmered as she walked, while Michael, in a tailored black suit, could not take his eyes off her. There were no flashing cameras, no endless speeches, only a gentle breeze, the soft hum of music, and vows whispered so softly they seemed meant only for the two of them. "I was broken, and you healed me," Michael said, his voice trembling as he slipped the band onto her finger. Amara, tears streaming freely, replied, "You were lost and you found me. Together, we are whole." As they sealed their promises with a kiss, the few guests erupted in quiet applause, but the loudest celebration was in Michael's heart. For once, love was not a weakness but his greatest strength. Later that night, as they sat by the fire with glasses of wine, Amara leaned against his shoulder and murmured, "Do you realize? They all said this would never work. And yet, here we are." Michael kissed her hair, smiling faintly. "Let them say what they want. The world has always been wrong about me. This time, it will stay wrong forever." Yet even after vows and rings, life did not magically erase its challenges. The world outside continued to test them. Michael's empire demanded attention, enemies still lurked, and Amara struggled to find her place in a life she had never imagined. But now, everything was different. They were no longer facing storms as two individuals, but as one united force. When journalists tried to dig into Amara's past, Painting her as an opportunist, Michael stood before cameras and silenced them with a single statement. She is not part of my story. She is the reason I have a story left to tell. When business rivals questioned his decisions, Michael reminded them with icy precision that his strength had not faded, it had been reborn. And when Amara faltered, overwhelmed by the weight of attention, Michael would hold her close and whisper, "Let the world scream. We will be silent here, where no one can touch us." Slowly, the noise around them began to fade. Their love, unshaken by spectacle, grew roots deep enough to weather every storm. What had started with blood and betrayal on a roadside had now become a life of shared laughter, quiet evenings, and a bond that not even the sharpest enemy could sever. Years later, when people spoke of Michael, they no longer spoke only of the empire he built or the enemies he defeated. They spoke of the man who had once nearly died and had been reborn through love. They spoke of Amara, the woman who had saved him, not just from death, but from himself. And when the two of them walked through the city streets hand in hand, no longer billionaire and savior, but husband and wife, they carried with them a reminder to everyone who watched that love is not reserved for the powerful, that redemption is not beyond reach, and that sometimes the greatest empires are built not of stone or steel, but of two hearts choosing each other against all odds. In the quiet of their home, surrounded by the laughter of children yet to be born and memories yet to be made, Michael would sometimes look at Amara and think of that night, the roadside, the pain, the brokenness, and realize it had been the beginning, not the end. And with a grateful heart, he would whisper once more the vow that had guided him since that night under the stars. "I will protect you, I will honor you, and I will never let this world hurt you again."